All right, it's me. Um, it is Black Friday. I've just finished up my student teaching and then had Thanksgiving, and I finished reading Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms. Um, this is a very interesting book. It's a very fascinating book, right? It's inherently a part of Ernest Hemingway's life, right? Ernest Hemingway, I say it's semi autobiographical, right? Ernest Hemingway did serve as an American ambulance driver during the Italian front during World War One. Fell in love with a nurse, and then I believe, if I remember correctly, that nurse, while he was then back on the front, left him. I think that's how that went, if I remember correctly. But right, so that's a little bit of that bit of background, right? That's very important to understand. I think a lot of the way that this book kind of plays out, but that's that. Farewell Arms. There's a lot of things to talk about, right? It's a fascinating parallelism between love and war, right? It is a beautiful, discussion about what it means to be a soldier and also what it means to be a lover. Lots of philosophy. So yeah. So I guess really to kind of break down, talking about, right, the war itself, right? War itself, he's on the Italian front, and Lieutenant Henry is facing this weird kind of social dynamic that is hard to describe because he is an American working as an Italian ambulance driver, right? So he is not within that inherent culture, although he does very well in it, right? He's one step off, right? But then also, right, he is a volunteer driver. And so he occupies this very weird position in which he is a lieutenant, and he's given that position of where he has this officer status, but also he is not, right, of an officer. He is not a war maker, right? He is an ambulance driver, right? That's what he wants to do, is, some sort of feeble attempt to save or protect anyone that he can, right? And so, and this comes up quite a bit of, especially in the first book of this, is that he doesn't quite understand where he fits because he relates to the officers and that's who he mostly talks to, but at the same time he's not the war maker, right? Which gets discussed a lot later on. I think it's in book 3 that this really gets discussed, but right, there's this concept that Hemingway puts out there, and it is repeated quite a bit, but it's this idea that, like, war is for the few and fought by the many, right? It is for a very small regiment of people that like war, right? But has to be fought by people who don't like it, right? It has to be fought by people that have no stake in this other than their country. This is a sentiment that I really don't think gets popularized in America until Vietnam, right? But it's a very true sentiment, right? Is that war in of itself, right, benefits a few very, very distinct people, but in order to have wars fought up until very recently was you had to then throw bodies at it, right? So that's that. There's a lot of discussion just in general about what it means to be in a war, right? Especially one that you don't want to be in. As we get towards the end of the book and we have Lieutenant Henry deserting, right, and running away from the Italian army, he constantly gets help from people, right, which is a good thing, right, because it shows that, you know, this isn't, what he's doing isn't abnormal, and what he's doing is considered right by some people, right? Because war is war, right? It's inherently not something that's pleasant to be a part of. It is something that is pleasant to romanticize, right? Anything else on the war bit? Anything else I've had said on the war bit? On the love bit, right? God, there are parts of the love bit that I really enjoy. There's parts that I really don't like, right? The love feels very of its time, right? In which Catherine, the love interest, is basically is constantly throughout the entire thing doing this. I will do whatever you want me to do to make you happy, right? We will do whatever you want to do. And basically just being this almost servant to Lieutenant Henry, which I'm not a big fan of, right? But I also understand that within the time period that would have made more sense, right? There's also this constant issue in which Catherine is trying to hide the baby that they eventually try to have, hides the baby for the entire time, right? And it is, you know, or considers herself disgusting or ugly because she is with child, right? Which part of it has to do with the generally traditionally conservative values that are within the system, right? Of, you know, children out of wedlock, right? So that's understandable. But it becomes obsessive, right? And Lieutenant Henry does nothing to really solve this or actually help with this other than just basically affirmations of like, yes, you are, right? Yes, you are still beautiful even though you are pregnant, right? So that was for me difficult to get through and read, but I also understand why it's there. Trying to think of anything else. Also the way that their love is structured, right? It starts off in book one being really this kind of like, she's madly in love with him and he's just horny, right? Right, that's where it initially starts, and then eventually becomes, you know, she gives in because that's what he wants, and they then have this child together. Or she was the British for she becomes with child, and then Lieutenant Henry, becomes actually in love with her in the way that we would in a modern setting would consider love, where she becomes very, very obsessive on the way that she looks and her presentation, which is where we get a lot of the disliking herself because she does look pregnant, right? And so there's there's a lot to unpack there, but right, it becomes a thing of, and Catherine says this quite a bit, of where like she doesn't view herself very positively because she feels that she's very plain. And so one of the big things is that she begins to really express herself and only view herself through her sexuality in relation to Lieutenant Henry, right? So once that's gone, that's all she obsesses over, because at the very beginning of the relationship, that's all he wanted, right? And so we're kind of fighting this battle in which they go basically in opposite directions, of where Henry starts off being just thinking about sex to actually loving her, and Catherine goes from like wanting a more traditional love to then focusing only on the sex part of it, which is it's an interesting dynamic to break down and look at. Yeah, that's that. There's also a great parallelism between love and war, because when it comes down to it, right, is that like they're just set up in the exact same way of Lieutenant Henry's time in war and on the front. It almost exactly is a mirror of this whole pregnancy that that they go through, right? And there's a lot of these same themes that are coming up and over and over and over again that usually have to do with bravery and courage, right? What does it mean to be brave? What does it mean to have courage in stressful situations, right? Which is a hard question to begin with, right? But right, they just the relationship between the timeline between the two and the way that they all work out is incredibly similar. And then our final ending between the two is where things change, right? Because with war, on the war side of things, this ends with Lieutenant Henry leaving, right? He almost gets shot, right? They're going to try to execute him because he's a lieutenant and Italy's losing the war. So they want to execute him. He manages to run away, save himself, and then managed to get back to his wife, right? And so in that version of it, right, he almost dies, but he manages to get through it. On the other side of things, we have the pregnancy, in which the baby dies during childbirth, and then Catherine then also dies as a result of childbirth. Hemorrhaging because of the cesarean section, I believe, is what the official death is. But right, in those instances, right, during the war, for the war portion of it, right, Lieutenant Henry manages to escape, manages to survive, but he's still constantly haunted by, he can't read the papers anymore, he can't do the things that he used to enjoy doing because he's constantly haunted by what is still happening. And on the pregnancy side, right, on the love side, right, we have this great parallelism throughout the entirety of it, and then the product of that relationship dies in the child, but then also the interest and the love dies, right? And so really what I think Hemingway is kind of expressing here is this concept or this belief that both in love and war, the only actual escape or removal of from the situation is through death, right? It is only through Lieutenant Henry dying is that he's ever going to be able to forget the war. It is only ever through dying that either Catherine or Lieutenant Henry are going to be able to forget their love, right? Because it's something that haunts them no matter what happens. And that's that. Fascinating book. It's a book that I wish I'd read in a more shortened setting, because I think I read like book 1 and book 2, and then like a week later I read book 3, and then 4 or 5 days later I read books 4 and 5. And so certainly I'm not remembering everything quite right, which is unfortunate, but right, that's those are my thoughts, right, on Ernest Hemingway's Farewell to Arms.